Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch for Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch for Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch for Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then Good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch for Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want.
Welcome, our friends, to the Switch for Good podcast. I'm Dotsie Bausch, and I'm here with lovely in purple, Alexandra Paul.
Yeah, you'll have to watch us on YouTube to see my incredible purple.
It's beautiful. All right, so I want to talk about cheese for a moment. It's on everyone's mind, and everyone wants it all the time. People want it. They want it at home. They want it in their sandwiches. They want it on the side, at a party, on a picnic with friends, next to their wine, on their salads, in their toaster, on their eggs, under and on top of their hot brown. And for those who don't know what a hot brown is, you haven't been to Kentucky, but it's basically layers of meat and cheese that could basically give you a heart attack if you have like 5 bites of it. If I have heard this once, I've heard it 1,000 times from people. Oh, I don't drink milk anyway, but I definitely can't give up my cheese. We literally, I think, have a love affair with cheese, and rightfully so, as most of us are mildly addicted to the morphine-like feeling of that calm fulfillment that we get when we eat it. Milk sales have plummeted, right, Alexandra, over the last few years to the tune of a little over 20%, but cheese sales have risen. Cheese is really the last stronghold. Cheese is the last domino to fall, if you will, before the dairy industry may just come crashing down. I actually wrote an op-ed style blog on this for our friends over at Stray Dog Capital on the subject matter of dairy and what the tipping points are for its demise. And if you guys listening want to check that out, we will make sure to put the link in our show notes. But what if we could easily give up cheese, dairy cheese, because there is an ooey gooey alternative cheese that's made from plants that takes us right back to our childhood as we sat next to dad or grandpa or grandma at the ballpark. A nacho cheese that would make you feel as good as it tastes because it's made from Alexandra's and I most favorite food on planet Earth, potatoes. Crazy enough as I would have not guessed this, nacho style cheese is the top seller at grocery stores across America. This was surprising to me. Tostitos, Frito-Lay, and Velveeta are the top 3, and they top the charts by over 40% compared to slices, shreds, and cheese wheels. So I don't know about you, but I have certainly been able to multiple times experience the incredible cheese sauces at my favorite vegan spots. Like, the chefs, high-end chefs are incredible, like the chef, Alexandra, that we've had on the podcast, Stephanie, who is the head chef and co-owner of Seabird's Restaurant here in my backyard, Costa Mesa, California. But I haven't been able to find this at home. I have never been able to find a nacho cheese or a dip or anything even close to that creamy, dreamy queso dip that they make at Seabird's. But I finally found it, y'all. I found it. It's real, and I really want to share it with you. It's called Loca, so L-O-C-A, Loca, and it's plant-based queso made from potatoes. My somewhat picky husband, very picky about cheese specifically, pointed and said, this is a game changer. The very first time he dipped a nacho chip into this decadent, creamy deliciousness. So y'all must indulge. You can go to eatlocafood.com, Loca, L-O-C-A, food.com, and enter the code LIQUIDGOLD for 20% off your order. The founder, Lauren, has become a friend of mine, and she's not paying us to talk about her cheese. I just felt it was too incredible and too delicious not to share with our listeners. So here you go. Again, eatlocafood.com and enter the code LIQUIDGOLD. We've got your back here at the Switch for Good podcast. We're not going to hide these things and keep them to ourselves. So on to our guest, though, Alexandra. Super pumped for a nutrigenomics expert and scientist to join us. And she's probably going to be able to explain to us why a cheese made from potatoes or vegetables could be good to our genes and encourage good cell output, and why maybe dairy cheese made from cows can turn on bad cell function and can lead to disease. So let me dive in and introduce our guest. Today, we are going to geek out on some science, which we know y'all love, and genetics and nutrition, and how nutrition plays a key role in our genetics, with our brilliant guest, Dr. Yael Joffe. She is a leading expert in the field of nutrigenomics, and she has been at it for nearly 30 years. As a practitioner scientist, she juggles her time running her Cape Town, South Africa clinic, 3x4, which I'm excited to dive into that name, as well as educating health practitioners on how they can incorporate nutrigenomics into their own work. Dr. Joffe is also the author of 3 books, countless scientific articles, and a member of the revolutionary team who mapped the very first nutrigenomic test in the year 2000. Oh, and I'm not done. I have to mention that she is an avid open water swimmer, just like someone else we know that's on this podcast with us, and it's not me. And she's a mom of 2. Wow. Welcome to the Switch for Good podcast, Dr. Joffe.
Great. Thanks, Dotsie. Thanks for that great intro. We could really just probably talk about swimming and not talk about genetics, or is that not going to happen?
Well, I'm going to make you talk about some nutrigenomics, but we could definitely touch on swimming. Let's just start there then. That sounds like fun. I want to go into a wonderful story too about your grandmother. So let's do some personal, Dr. Joffe, before we go into the nutrigenomics. How did you get into open water swimming? Do you compete? Are you still very active in it?
I do not compete, as in I am not competitive. I do compete in the sense that I do every possible event I can. And yeah, I like most people started off as a runner, got injured, herniated disc, the usual story, discovered swimming, absolutely fell in love with it, and then discovered the open water and discovered the ocean. And so it's probably been about 6-7 years now. And I think, you kind of start at the ocean and you realize there's this extremely amazing vulnerability and nature and just immersion in the ocean. And then I discovered the cold, which was the next step for me, and being able to withstand cold water ocean swimming. And it's like any addiction, it sucks you in, and eventually, so it's my meditation, it's my escape, it's my way of connecting with the world and nature. So as I said, don't get me started. It's a real extraordinary gift to be able to swim in the ocean.
That sounds like quite a passion. Is the ocean down there generally warmer or colder? Like our Pacific Ocean, even in the summer, is still just pretty chilly. So what is the ocean like off the coast of Cape Town?
Well, we actually have 2, because as you know, Cape Town, right, there's a triangle. So we have the Indian Ocean, which is obviously warmer. I do not live on the Indian Ocean side. And we have the Atlantic Ocean. Right. And the Atlantic Ocean is very cold all year round. And in fact, it's cold in summer. So we have, I would say, like a lot of our time is swimming at about 50 Fahrenheit.
Ooh, yeah.
It's chilly. So sometimes we'll go up to 60. But we do between 50 and 60, and so it's chilly. So our air is beautiful and warm, but our water is very cold, yeah.
Dr. Hanna Kaliova about the benefits of cold water. She was talking about showers, not swimming. So I'm sure you're reaping a lot of emotional and physical benefits from it. I myself do not swim in cold water. So when I choose my races, which I haven't done in a while, there always have to be warm water. Yeah, between 70 and 80. that's where you got me. So
but we might bump into each other in Mauritius, maybe. But otherwise not. No, I'm the absolute opposite, you know. And as I said, like for me, you become completely addicted to that cold. And as you said, there's a huge amount of scientific research which talks about cold water immersion. Yeah. And as you say, a lot of people using cold showers, which is great. If that's what you can access, that's great. And we talk about like vagus nerve stimulation and how fantastic it is for our mind, our mood, our behavior, our sleep. So I'm a big fan from a science point of view. I've experienced it. You know, we have a huge swimming community, and we see how so many people with mood disorders or who are battling with anxiety and depression are drawn into cold water swimming. And it is a genetic story, right? Because it's this cold water that actually switches on genes that are related to managing anxiety and depression. So like certain foods we can eat that switch on genes, exercise we can do that change the way our genes behave and switch on, but the same thing with cold water immersion. So there is a great science story and a great genetic story there as well.
Oh, well, that is incredibly fascinating. Maybe we can dive into that as we start to serpentine through all of the aspects of our life that affect our genes, not just food. But this is fascinating to me. You started as an architect during your university years, but you switched to dietetics after your grandmother was diagnosed with cancer.
I was studying architecture and I absolutely loved it. And then that's right, my gran was diagnosed with cancer, died very quickly.
What kind of cancer?
It was a GI cancer, so her whole gastrointestinal tract. And by the time they discovered it, she was so far gone, they closed her up and kind of sent her home to die. And that set me off on my journey of, you know, how can this be? How did we not know? What could she have done differently? How could we ever prevented it? And actually that was the real aha moment for me of like, I love architecture, but really this is not okay, that we didn't have answers. And so it set me off on this very, very long journey that I'm still on to try find out why she died the way she died, but also what could she have done differently. And so I went looking for a degree in health in the late 1980s. Absolutely did not exist, a degree in health. And the closest degree, it's still hard to find a degree in health, right? But the closest degree that I thought would be right for me, which was dietetics. So I went on to study dietetics and become a dietitian, but appalled, disappointed with the whole experience. So, you know, 3 weeks into my dietetics kind of degree, I already knew that it had nothing to do with health. And this was, you know, quite some time ago.
What was appalling? What was appalling to you about the whole field?
I'll give you an example. So 3 weeks in, we're in a dietetics lecture, and we being taught by this lecturer that they have a chronic disease patient, so cardiovascular disease, I can't remember, or diabetes, in the hospital, very ill, and she's talking about like, so what would you recommend to feed this patient? And the answer was chocolate cake and ice cream.
What?
And I'm like, yeah, you're right. Appalling. You wanted appalling. I'm giving you. I'm like, how is this possible? And she's like, well, it's got protein, it's got carbohydrate, it's got calcium, it's got vitamins. And I'm sitting there and I'm having that horrible feeling where your stomach just falls and goes, I left home, I changed degrees, I went seeking answers, and they're telling me chocolate cake and ice cream. Like there is something so fundamentally wrong with what is happening here. And it never got particularly better. I mean, that's the reality. And I almost left. I was so upset, but I didn't really have anywhere else to go. There wasn't else to have. So I decided I would finish my dietetics degree. I was absolutely awful to have as a student. You can imagine. It was like, I would be like, I don't agree. Why? That's terrible. What about brown rice? What about steamed vegetables? What about kimchi? You can imagine, drove them mad. And it never got better. Never got better. But I finished it because I needed a degree. And it was really, in fact, I went and I had to do postgrad, another 2 years of it. Never got better. And so when I went to London, as you said, and ended up working in a nutrition clinic, I wasn't working in a nutrition clinic because I love nutrition. I was actually working there to make money to go traveling in Europe. Okay. And that was the only way I could make money. That was the degree I had, right? Yeah. So I actually was so angry and so disillusioned with this profession that I was leaving dietetics. I was just going to work there long enough to earn some money to travel, and then I was out of there. And I actually didn't know what that next thing was going to be. So I was that exact age where you've got a backpack and, you know, and while I was at this clinic in London, they were approached by someone called Dr. Rosalind Gill-Garrison, who was she's a geneticist, and herself was an extraordinary visionary. And she had this idea that the future of medicine was going to be genetics and nutrition. And she wanted to start a company, and she had an angel investor, and she was looking for a dietitian to work with her to build the first genetic test. And she came to this clinic, and they only had one dietitian in the clinic. That was me. And she's like, would you like to spend a couple of days with me? I was like, fantastic. I get to travel to Southampton. I get to take a train. I get a little Airbnb, but I have no idea what nutrigenomics is. And she said, don't worry, we'll give you some papers to read, you know. So on the way down the train to Southampton, I'm reading these papers about MTHFR and ApoE, still didn't understand anything. Anyway, I had 2 fantastic days with her. And even though I really and truly did not understand anything that she was saying, there was something about the conversation that really excited me, that this idea that that genetics could influence nutrition or vice versa. And it just sparked something in me. And she turned around and said, well, you know, we need a dietitian who specializes in genetics. I'm like, I know nothing. I don't even remember chromosomes. I don't remember genes. But if you prepare to be patient with me, I'll study and I'll learn, and I'd love to come and join you. And that's what happened. So I landed up joining Saona, and I landed up moving to the US. I lived in Boulder, Colorado, which is an awesome place to go and live if you're going to go live in the US, you know, from London, and landed up kind of growing up in Saona and literally studying from a biology textbook. And the thing is that I knew so little that I was like, just so grateful for these extraordinary mentors. There were 3 women who really changed my life in terms of mentorship. But the one thing I realized quite early on is that the geneticists, and there were 2, Rosalind and Peter Grimaldi, had the really cool job. They had the good job. They got to choose the genes and study the genetics. And then they'd come to me and say, so what diet would you recommend? Or like, what? And I'm like, no. I don't want to be doing like vitamin recommendations. I want to be building genetic tests.
Okay.
So that's when I realized that if I was going to do this, I had to go back to university, that I wasn't going to be able to do it on a dietetics degree and a biology textbook. So I went back to university, and that's when I did a PhD in genetics, but specializing in nutrigenomics. And that was a very long journey, because obviously I was working at the same time. I had 2 little children. And also there were no supervisors for nutrigenomics in those days. It was the early 2000s, and there wasn't someone who I could go and say, like, can you be my nutrigenomics supervisor? So we had to like cobble a degree together and like put supervisors together to kind of guide me on the journey. So that's really how the university thing happened.
So you're an underachiever, I understand. So we got that laid out. Before we dive in, or as we are currently diving into nutrigenomics, I want to give you kind of how I understand it in layman's terms, and then you can course correct, for our audience if I have it wrong. It's just so simply, because it's not that simple, but in a few sentences, to me, from what I've understood and learned so far, is that food and its chemical makeup has the power to either turn our cells and their functions on and off by either disrupting good cell proliferation or disrupting bad cell proliferation or multiplication. Is that generally what it is? And like I said, correct where I have it off.
I think you've overcomplicated it. We're actually going to go back to, right? Good. We're going to go back to some simple principles. And also you did 50%, you did a good job, but you did like half the puzzle.
Okay.
And actually you missed the first part of the puzzle. So the first part of the puzzle is very simple. It says like this, right? We have a genetic blueprint that determines who we are. And it's based on a code, a DNA sequence code that's in every single cell of ours. And at 99.9%, we're all identical in our code. But at 0.1%, we differ in that code. And remember, a code is just like an alphabet. In genetics, there's 4 letters. In English, there's 26. But we have a code written about us, and that's why we call it our blueprint. And at 0.1%, we differ, which means that 3 to 4 million places in our DNA, you and I are different from each other.
Wow.
Now, those differences determine how we respond to the world around us, how we exist in the world. So many people, when they think about nutrigenomics, they think about, you know, I need to eat more vegetables or caffeine or lactose, right? But actually, the story is much more complex and actually much more beautiful than that, because it's how do we exist in this world and how do we respond to the world around us. So absolutely, our genetics will determine how we respond to the food that we eat, whether that food is caffeine or lactose or vegetables or vitamins or gluten or iron in our meat or any of those things. But there's more than that. How do we respond differently to exercise? So some of us, when we train, we get stronger and fitter quickly and fast. Some of us get injured. Some of us need a lot of time of recovery. So how do we respond when we start having this kind of activity around our body? What about stress? Why do some of us manage to be so much more resilient to stresses in our lives and others of us less? What about viruses like COVID? Why are some of us more susceptible? Or when we get the virus, we get more ill? So everything about nutrigenomics is how we respond to the world around us. And that is driven by what we call genetic variation. So it's these small little spelling changes in our DNA. And it's those spelling changes in our DNA that we test for. So the other thing is, I actually don't have a clinic anymore. I have a company called 3x4 Genetics, which is actually a genetic testing company, where we're actually able to test with a cheek swab and look at those spelling changes in your DNA and help you understand how you respond to your world around you. Not just your food, supplements, exercise, calories, energy, buffet tables, nutrients, stress, trauma, all of these things we're able to assess by understanding. So we talk about self-knowledge. So nutrigenomics is actually self-knowledge. Who am I? How do I understand myself? How do I respond to the world? Okay. Now that's one piece of the puzzle, which is what I'm putting in. Now let's come to talk about what you spoke about. The second piece of the puzzle is the way that our bodies work is that our genes are continually switching on and off. So to use an example that I'm sure you will completely appreciate, I walk into a coffee shop in the morning and I order a latte. And in that latte is going to be a whole lot of dairy milk and a whole lot of caffeine. Now my body is going to respond to that order, that drink. Remember, how do we respond to the world around us? So our genetic spelling will determine how we are able to metabolize or break down lactose in the dairy milk, as well as metabolize caffeine. That's one part of it. But what actually switches on those enzymes? What makes the lactose enzyme switch on, assuming it's there and available, right, and the caffeine enzyme switch on, right? Because some of us are not going to be able to do it all, is the food we take in. So we drink that caffeine. The presence of the caffeine will send a signal to switch on the gene that makes the caffeine enzyme so that I can metabolize. So now we've got two things we're going to learn about ourselves through genetics. One is what I call insight, understand myself, self-knowledge. And the other one is action. When I do something, it changes the way my genes behave. It changes the way my genes switch on and off. And that could be exercise. So when I do a 100-meter sprint, the genes that are going to switch on and off are going to be very different than if I'm running a very slow marathon. So everything we do in our life, every micro decision of every minute of every day will change the way our genes behave, and our genetics will change how we respond. So those are the two pieces of the genetics puzzle that determine how genetics impacts our health and our health journey.
Mm-hmm.
So before we go into more about nutrigenomics, can we talk about the gene itself and what percentage is inherited and what percentage is changeable? And I think epigenetics comes in here, and maybe you could define that, because that word has been thrown around quite a bit, and I think a lot of our audience might not know exactly what that means, including myself.
So actually, I have been talking about epigenetics. I just didn't use the word epigenetics. So epigenetics are all the things that our body is exposed to that will change the way our genes switch on and off. So when we are a stressor, whether it's a trauma, physical or emotional, or pollution, or a pharmaceutical drug or recreational drug, or pesticides and herbicides, or something even healthy, eating beautiful fresh organic vegetables, has an epigenetic action. So epigenetics means epi, outside of genetics, means outside of the DNA code, and genetics is the code. So it's just such a complicated word, epigenetics, that I don't really like to use it because it has so many layers of science to it. So what's more important is epigenetics is those micro decisions we're making every single day of what our body engages with, exposes with, consumes, that switch on and switch off genes. And that is the essence of epigenetics. And I will mention the word bioactives because there are molecules, very small molecules inside some of the food that we eat that act in this extraordinary bioactive way to switch on genes. So an example is our cruciferous vegetables, our broccoli, our cauliflower, our cabbage, our kale, kohlrabi, that contain a precursor called glucoraphanin, but the magic molecule is a sulforaphane, which in my opinion is the molecule of the century that is able to switch on genes that are able to heal our body. So we love sulforaphane because so the difference between eating something to plug a hole. So we eat an orange because it contains vitamin C, and we need vitamin C in our body. That's great. But when we eat raw broccoli or raw cabbage or any of them, because if you cook it, it doesn't work, by the way, and we eat that raw broccoli, and we've got this extraordinary molecule of sulforaphane, and it switches on hundreds of genes that are all defense genes to heal our body. Now nutrition has power. So when we coined the term food as medicine, we were talking about nutrigenomics. Mm-hmm. Because just having an orange for vitamin C is a deficiency conversation. I'm just going to plug some vitamin C into my body. When you can make genes switch on, you're having a healing conversation.
Okay. So when people say, well, I inherited X illness from my family, how much control do we have over that? Is it 100% that if we lived a certain lifestyle, we could change our genes so that we could overcome our genetics?
So this goes back to the other question you asked me before, which is how much comes from our genes and how much comes from our diet and lifestyle decisions? And there is no answer that I can give you for that. And I'll explain why. Let's talk about weight, right? So we know that in the world of obesity and genetics, we talk about heritability, which is how much is inherited from our genes that will determine how I look or act or disease or anything. And in genetics of weight or obesity, it ranges between 40 and 80%. Now, that is a huge range. So think about people you know. Think about people who, no matter what they eat, they don't gain weight. They are genetically resistant to gaining weight. In their case, genetics is playing 100% because it doesn't matter what they do, they're not going to gain weight. And then think of the people who, despite making great food choices, exercising, reducing their intake, doing everything that they're told, they still cannot lose weight, or they lose weight very slowly and it rebounds back. And they look around and everyone else is doing so brilliantly, but for them, doesn't matter what they do, they're not able to shift their weight. And we call this weight loss resistance. So in that individual, genetics might be playing an 80% role in stopping weight loss. So this idea that we can say that the genetics of weight or the genetics of cancer, or the genetics of diabetes is one number can't be true, because the whole point about genetics is personalization. That we all have this different blueprint of how susceptible we are. So for some, exercise is a perfect point of view. Now, you can inherit the ability to run fast, and the training and nutrition and everything will determine whether you land up on the podium, but you needed to have a really strong genetic inheritance of really good sports genes to even get close. So in that case, it's quite high genetics. So every person will sit somewhere in that spectrum. But when we think about the genetics of weight, for example, we like to think that at least minimum half are going to come from our genes and half from our decision making. But when we look at the individual, it might be higher or less, if that makes sense. And the same thing with diabetes, with heart disease, with cancer, is that diet and lifestyle will always have an impact, but in every individual, it'll range more or less. Mm-hmm. And I just want to make one more comment before I stop speaking, which is there are diseases that have a very strong genetic component. So when we talk about breast cancer, everyone talks about the BRCA gene, the BRCA1 and BRCA2, or the Angelina Jolie gene. And in this gene, if you have the spelling change, the variant, your risk of getting breast cancer is fairly high, but it's not set in stone. And the decisions that you make throughout your life around diet and lifestyle and exposures, obviously toxin exposures, as well as all the other genes in your body and what they're doing, how efficiently you detox, your inflammatory genes, your oxidative stress genes, your methylation genes, your estrogen genes, will all determine whether that BRCA gene expresses itself and leads to cancer, or whether it stays silent in your body. So there are very few diseases that are 100% genetic. There are, but they're super, super rare. Very, very rare.
So we had Angelina Jolie's breast surgeon, Dr. Christy Funk, on, and she spoke a ton about sulforaphane as well, and the power. And then it's mostly cruciferous vegetables. Is that right?
It's only really cruciferous
vegetables.
Okay.
Yeah. Is that akin to sulfuric acid in any way?
No.
Okay.
So if I can, do you want to, should I explain a little bit about it? It is quite extraordinary.
It is. And yes, that would be fantastic.
So these vegetables, these cruciferous vegetables, again, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kohlrabi, kale, bok choy, Brussels sprouts. Yeah. And of course, the purest form is going to be broccoli sprouts, right?
Oh, yeah.
Which you can
she said that. Yeah.
Grow yourself, or you can buy. Now, in these vegetables, there is a compound called glucoraphanin, much less spoken about. And there is an enzyme called myrosinase. Two names you don't need to remember. But when you bite into your broccoli salad, which is raw or lightly steamed, and you chew on that broccoli, you break open that glucoraphanin, you expose it to this beautiful enzyme myrosinase, and the action of that enzyme on glucoraphanin converts it into this molecule called sulforaphane. Okay. Now, sulforaphane does many, many, many things. In fact, we can have a sulforaphane conversation around COVID even. But what it does is it switches genes on. Now, there's a group of genes in what we call phase 2 detoxification, which is how good is my body to remove toxins. Now, toxins can come from inside our body, like hormone metabolites, like hormone things that have been converted that we really want to get out of our body because they don't do well for our body when they stay. And then we can, of course, have toxins from our outside. So from drinking bottled water and living in Beijing. So this phase 2 detoxification is really important in capturing those toxins, converting them into a form that we can get them out the body. And sulforaphane switches on all the genes that is able to detox those toxins. But sulforaphane is even more amazing than that, because there is something called a master switch. Well, there's a whole bunch of them in our body. So now you walk into your house, and as you walk in, you've got a switch at the front door. And when you switch on the switch, it switches on all the lights in your house. So before we were talking about sulforaphane is switching on one gene here, one gene there, one gene there. Now we're talking about the concept of a master switch, which in science we call a transcription factor. And what happens with sulforaphane is it goes into the house and it switches on the master switch, which is called NRF2. Also one of the most exciting discoveries in health and science. And when sulforaphane switches on NRF2, NRF2 switches on 500 genes in our body. And these 500 genes are all about defending our health. It decreases inflammation, it captures free radicals, it detoxes toxins, it switches on 500 lights in our house that are all about defending our body. So if there's, I always say, like people say, if there's one thing that I would advise, like one piece of advice I would leave people, it's cruciferous vegetables. The trick is you have to eat them raw or just lightly less than 30-second steam. And that's actually really tough for most people, you know, unless you're like really good, put some in your smoothies, but it is really tough. So there are so the other one is broccoli sprouts, which you can put into smoothies and just sprinkle on salads because they have the highest yield of glucoraphanin. And the other way is there are some really good supplements on the market. And if I have patients that just cannot tolerate eating vegetables, and there are definitely many of those, raw, then I will use a supplement because it's such an extraordinary compound. So in the case of breast cancer, I'm always using it. The only time or breast cancer prevention is when they're having treatment, then I don't use it because actually it's so powerful in detoxifying the body, it detoxifies the chemo right out of the body.
Oh my
so we
God.
don't actually, it's so good at detoxifying. It sees chemo as a toxin and it clears the toxin, it clears chemo. So we don't use it then. But in every other way. So the interesting thing here is.
So when you say supplements, sulforaphane supplements?
Yeah, so they're not actually sulforaphane. They're more glucoraphanin.
That's what I was, okay.
So exactly. So there's some really good companies. You have to get an active supplement where it's got glucoraphanin and myrosinase. If it doesn't have myrosinase, it can't create sulforaphane. You can't actually bottle sulforaphane.
Okay. Well, I think we learned from several doctors whom we have interviewed that there are several ways to get around the raw issue. And one is to sprinkle mustard seed on top of your vegetables, which also helps activate the sulforaphane. I might be putting it wrong. Another one, Dr. Greger says, is to cut your vegetables, wait 40 minutes, and then cook them. I don't know how you feel about that, Dr. Joffe, but those were two examples how we can make the most of our cruciferous vegetables, which can be very hard on the digestive system when they're raw, and still get some, the benefits.
I think you'll get benefits. You'll always get benefits from eating vegetables. I've never heard of that in terms of getting sulforaphane out of them. So that I don't know, because the moment that the myrosinase enzyme is heated, it's deactivated.
Oh, okay.
So I stick by there's a lot of research in that. I certainly don't know everything, but
we'll all dive deeper. This is good.
Dive deeper.
Yeah, for sure.
And the patients that can't tolerate raw, I do use a supplement. I absolutely use a supplement, and I take it every morning because for me, and everyone I know takes, it's probably one of the most extraordinary discoveries of the last couple of decades in terms of nutrition. And when we talk about the power of nutrition, sulforaphane is a beautiful, it's not the only one. We've got curcumin and polyphenols and turmeric and vitamin D. Vitamin D is extraordinary. It's very well, we're hearing all about it now more than ever. And there's a gene called the vitamin D receptor gene, which is also a master switch. So when we switch on that gene, VDR, and we got to make sure we have enough vitamin D in our body to be able to do that, we're switching on a whole lot of other switches. So, I'm focusing on sulforaphane, but there are a whole lot of other amazing food molecules, or what we call bioactives, that are able to switch on genes and help us heal the body.
Okay.
Are you comfortable giving the name of a company, supplement company? Because there are so many supplement companies that are not reputable because it's not very well regulated, at least here in the United States.
I'm seeing a lot of, I'm on Amazon because I was just like, God, how do you find these? And I put in the myrosinase, and there's 3 that are, it sounds like they are literally broccoli seeds and broccoli sprouts and mustard seeds, like just crushed up. Is that what we're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, truthfully, if you're buying the supplements on Amazon, they're probably not best. So I prefer the practitioner-based companies of supplements.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to be much higher quality.
Mm-hmm.
So my go-to, I'll share it. I mean, I'm sure there'll be others, just because it's actually just broccoli sprouts dehydrated and put into a capsule. So it's Cell Logic, CELL Logic. And if you just search Cell Logic USA, because it is an Australian company. Mm-hmm. And just to say it again, the reason I like them, they've got the science to show the yield, the sulforaphane yield. The myrosinase is activated when you take the supplement, and it's only broccoli sprouts dehydrated and put into a capsule. So it's actually what I would call a food-based supplement.
Great.
As opposed to an extract of something. So when you see, there's many products in the market where it's broccoli seed extract, it's no. You just want broccoli sprouts dehydrated, crushed, and put into a capsule. And you want the company to show you what that yield of sulforaphane is. So yeah.
Got it.
So it sounds like there are some things that are good for every human, no matter what their genes are, and that sulforaphane and the cruciferous vegetables are those, unless they might have an intolerance to them, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you've got microbiome issues, so if you've got what we call gut dysbiosis, where you're really battling with your gut, it's very hard to tolerate cruciferous vegetables. So there are, there's others. Another reason is there's some who have a very hyper taste sensitivity to bitter. And then they also battle with cruciferous vegetables. So it does, they just don't want to eat vegetables. But just to your point, people say to me, why do I need a genetic test to tell me to eat cruciferous vegetables when you're telling me they're good for everyone, right? So, and in fact, we know that vegetables are good for everyone. So the thing about genetics is there's a very big difference. So here's an example. We know that smoking is really bad for everyone. But remember that 40 to 80%. But for some people, smoking will be really bad. And for others, it'll be devastating. Mm-hmm. Because our ability to conjugate, to capture those smoke particles, which are toxins, convert them into something that can be excreted from our body and getting it out of our body. So we know about people who smoke cigarettes until they were 100 and they died in their sleep, right? So we all have a different responsiveness. So the other word for nutrigenomics is responsiveness. So I'm sitting with patients and I'm trying to get them to make positive behavior, I'm getting them to understand why with their genes, those behaviors that I'm recommended are not something that they read in the dietary guidelines. These are things that speak directly to their genes, not to my genes, not to your genes, and genes don't change. So if they want to live a longer, healthier, happier, better life, they need to make those changes to be able to ensure that there's a better match between their genes and the choices that they're making. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is quantity. So for some people, having 1 to 2 portions a day, or even 1 portion a day of cruciferous vegetables is enough. But if we see in your genetics that your detox is suboptimal, your oxidative stress is suboptimal, your inflammation is too high, we don't want 1 portion a day. We want 3, 4, 5 portions a day. And no one's going to eat 3, 4, 5 portions. So we try to get a couple of portions in food and we top it up with a supplement. So it's about quantity, and it's about getting people to understand why they need to make the behavioral change that they do.
Mm-hmm. I would love to understand how much two individuals, let's say optimum diets for them, can range based on their genes. And here's an example of something that I personally experienced. About a year or so before Olympics, we got a gene test. One thing that came out was that I had a sprinter gene that I didn't know. I had always been more a road cyclist and endurance based. But it was a key that unlocked the understanding for me and my coaches of why I was responding so well to explosive power training. So that was cool just to go, oh, you just sort of unlock something that you didn't really understand before. The second thing that came up was that my optimum diet was Mediterranean. And my guess is they didn't even have a plant-based diet on the spectrum of choices back then. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But it came up as Mediterranean, which was basically a plant-based diet for me because I've never eaten fish because I just don't like the taste. So it basically, was that for me. And I was like, okay, that makes sense why I enjoy it so much. I like it. I didn't have any trouble transitioning from an animal-based diet to a plant-based diet. It was like, oh, this is fun. This is delicious. Everything about it just felt good to my body. But there's certainly people that Alexandra and I come across all the time in our work that will say, I can't try a plant-based diet, or I don't want to because my body needs meat. Have you come across anything in your research and kind of going back to that original question of, two individuals' optimum diets and how much they can really differ? And if that could be a thing where people's body needs whatever it might be, whatever they say.
So there's so much in what you just said. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. So we'll leave the sprinter gene because that makes total sense. I mean, we can have a whole conversation about that in itself. The second part is I have a suspicion I know which genetic test you did based on the conversation you just had.
Okay.
I think it's my old company that I used, the tests I built before, 3x4. But I take issue with the Mediterranean diet conversation, and here's why. And that's why it's not my current genetic testing company, is that it is my belief that we are not at a point in the science yet where we're able to determine from genetics a diet plan. And by that I mean what we're seeing at the moment, and in the company I suspect that you tested with, which is you were either going to be low fat, you were going to be low carb, or you're going to be Mediterranean.
Okay.
Right? They have three options.
I didn't know that, but okay.
Yeah. Exactly. You wouldn't have known because, right. You're just seeing what you're seeing, right? So they divide it up into three. And there are a couple of companies that do this. They say that you're going to have, or they do macronutrient distribution, 40% carbohydrate and 30% protein and 30% fat. But actually, genetics is way more subtle than that and way more complex. And so my issue is if you, like the blood group diet, right? So someone made a lot of money on the blood group diet, and an individual's blood group is genetic, right? Our genes determined a blood group. And they came up with this book and this extremely successful career around the idea that your blood group will determine your diet. So now we've gone from having one dietary guideline for everyone, which is the US dietary guidelines, to having literally like 3 or 4 diets for the whole population of the whole world. Okay. But we have 25,000 genes. And we have 3 to 4 million of these genetic variations that are telling us how you respond to the world around you. So when you do a genetic test and they divide it up into Mediterranean, low fat or low carb, we're falling into the same trap, which is that let's simplify things. We're going to take a beautiful, complex science and we're going to simplify it and so make it nice and easy for you to manage. And I don't have to spend too much time as a practitioner trying to explain to you or personalizing your diet thing. So I just want to make a comment about that the Mediterranean diet means 100 different things to 100 different people. And for some people, Mediterranean diet will be plant-based, and for some it'll have lots of protein in. So it depends where in the Mediterranean you live, etc. Okay, anyway, but let's speak to the question that you asked, which was an excellent question, which is, can there really be such a difference in what is an optimum diet for the individual? That one individual will thrive, like yourself, on a plant-based diet, and another person will thrive on a ketogenic diet.
Yeah.
And I don't mean a plant-based ketogenic. I'm talking about animal proteins and animal fats and very few vegetables and very low fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is absolutely yes. That this idea that there is, and we see it every single day. And so I am trying to not fall into the trap, great English, of the next best thing. Because when you've been a dietitian for 30 years, the next best thing rolls around really, really often. You know, it's like cholesterol and eggs, and then it's margarine, and then it's butter, and then it's dairy. So I try just hold back and rather focus on the individual. Because even in the last years, I've lived through banting, paleo, ketogenic, intermittent fasting, complete fasting. Vegan obviously is huge now. We did vegetarian, now we're doing vegan. So for me, I always try not get sucked into that and rather say, let me think about who this person is. Let me look at their genes, because there are some people who really do connect with the iron, the heme that is in animal product. And there are some people who just thrive on plant. So for me, that's why we don't sell our genetic tests direct to consumers.
Okay.
Because we need to understand who you are, how you're responding to the world around you, both at a genetic level, but at an emotional, spiritual, physical, what you want out of life, what your goals are. And we take your genetics and we put it together with everything that you are in this world, and then we personalize your diet. But genetics alone, without understanding who you are as a person and how you exist in the world, cannot solve those problems. I hope that was like a very long answer for a very short question, but I hope that gave you an answer.
It was great, because it's very complicated. There's a lot of information and misinformation out there. So I think it was fantastic and helpful.
The Human Genome Project allowed for all your work. And I'd like you to touch on that so that people understand where it all came from. When you said 25,000 genes we have, and we have 3 to 4 million variants, I was like, whoa, that's amazing. And also, I'd like to talk about all the companies and tests that came out of this Human Genome Project that are marketing to us. Dots took the 23andMe test. I have an identical twin sister who took it and then just sent me her results. Oh, we're basically the same. And frankly, I got this thing and I had no idea what to do with it. The only thing I gleaned from it was that I'm way too white. Talk to us about how the Human Genome Project started and what came out of it, and what are we supposed to do with that?
100%. Brilliant question. Question of the night. So in 2003, what happened was scientists mapped the human genome. What they did was they took our chromosomes, they unraveled them, they laid them flat. And remember I said in the beginning that genetics is just a language. And it has 4 letters in the alphabet, A, C, G, and T. And they literally put out the chromosomes and they started writing A, C, T, G, what they saw, right? And so for the first time, we got this code of who we were. And the way it works is that every 3 letters, we call a codon, is a code for an amino acid. So when you write CCG, it tells us that code is making an amino acid lysine or alanine. And when we put amino acids together, we get proteins. And proteins drive our body, enzymes, hormones, brain messenger, everything. So for the first time, we were able to read the code of our DNA. But reading the code does not mean understanding the code, okay? Or knowing what to do with the code. So what happened was, and it was an extraordinary feat, and they made it public access. So anyone could go into the internet and could see the whole human genome there. Understanding though that we are different at 0.1%. So 3 to 4 million places in this code that they wrote, there are going to be differences between us. Okay. Now the problem is there's a difference between data and value. So what happened is a lot of companies, everyone was like, we're going to get on the genetics bandwagon. Mm-hmm. We're going to build genetic tests. This is biotech. We're going to be really wealthy and build super big companies and sell genetic data. We're going to sell genetic tests. And so I talk about like the mushroom of the last decade, where every morning I wake up, there's a new genetic testing company. Literally, there's a new genetic testing company. And the price of genetic testing got cheaper, and we could test so much, so we did. And we took all these genes with these names, and we put them into genetic tests, and we marketed them. And we'll talk about 23andMe is a little bit different. We marketed them and said, we're going to give you recommendations, diet, lifestyle, supplement, and you can buy all your supplements from us as well. So we'll sell you a genetic test, and we'll sell you all the supplements for every single gene that we're testing. And so I often talk about my, that experience I had with dietetics when I started is being my experience of the genetic testing marketplace. And 23andMe is actually both a hero and a villain, because 23andMe brought the conversation of genetics into the consumer marketplace. And they have done a magnificent job in ancestry. And 95% of all genetic tests that are bought in the world are ancestry. Where do I come from? Who's my cousin? And it's not about health, right? But of course, 23andMe marketed this health product where you can find out your caffeine metabolism of one gene, and they test one gene to tell you whether you're likely to be obese or not. So they really weren't interested in health. They weren't interested in context. They weren't interested in who you are. They weren't interested in your health goals or your medical history. They just wanted to give you your data, and they wanted you to give them your data so they could package it and sell it to a pharmaceutical company and build new drugs. And they've never really pretended to be anything different than that. I don't think that 23andMe have ever said that they were, out to fix health. They really wanted to sell data. The problem is the other, what I call the rats and mice, the other companies who build genetic tests. They throw a whole lot of genes in, they come up with some recommendations. They either sell exercise plans or most of them sell supplements. But the value of that information has been diluted. So the more genes you put into a genetic test that aren't good science, they dilute the genes that have good science. So I always say to people, if you see a genetic test and they're offering you $99 for 500 or 1,000 or 500,000 genes, it's a major red flag. Because the way the science is at the moment, there's only a couple of hundred of these genetic variants, these differences that give us insight into who we are. So if you're seeing genetic tests with 500 or 1,000 genes in, of those, 80 or 90% do not have good science, which means you're buying data, but not insight about yourself. So you really want to, when you decide who to work with as a genetic company, you want to understand who they are, who their scientists are, how they choose genes. So we have something called Darwin, which we built, which is, the idea is Darwin survived, only the fittest genes survive, that only the genes that have the best science, that are shown to be so scientifically valid, but more than that, they're shown to be clinically useful. This gene will give me information that will make me as a dietitian make a better decision for my patient than if I didn't have this genetic information. So good science is fine, but it's only a baseline. What I really want to use genetics for is clinical insight. Can I understand something about you through this gene? Can I make a better treatment, a better exercise plan, a better supplement recommendation with this information? Because if not, it doesn't matter if it's a $29.99 test or a $500 test, you are only buying data, and you wake up in the morning and you don't know what to eat for breakfast. So we at 3x4. So when I got to the end, I had my clinic, I have an education company, I've built a couple of companies' tests, and I was just so disillusioned with the genetic testing industry that I left. And I focused only on teaching, only on education. And then I opened a clinic, and then I realized that in the clinic, I didn't have a genetic test to use that I felt safe with, that I could trust. Because I was getting Mediterranean diet recommendations, which wasn't actually telling me anything about the person who's sitting in front of me. So I decided as a last, I'm like getting to the end of this, 30 years down the road, I'm going to build one more genetic test. And I'm going to build a company that doesn't just focus on the data, but focuses on the translation, storytelling, imagery, education, mentorship, community, support, because all of those things are as important as the report you receive from your practitioner.
Yeah, because people need to know how to implement. It's like, now what do I do? I know this is possible, this field, but what do I do besides eat broccoli sprouts? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you don't only need great science. You don't only need a beautiful report that you can interact with and engage with, and it's got colors and images and storytelling, but you need practitioners, and I don't care if they're dietitians, naturopaths, chiropractors, psychiatrists, dentists, it doesn't matter, nurses, obviously doctors, but you need them to know how to use genetics, how to integrate it into what they're doing, how to translate it, and how to give you information that will add value to your daily life. Those micro decisions we spoke about? Every day, I make many, many micro decisions that will contribute to my health. And how can genetics help an individual make the best micro decisions? And you need a practitioner to take you on that journey. And practitioners don't learn it at university. So we needed to build, I had an education company, so we moved the education company into the genetics company to make sure that every practitioner who works with me gets trained in understanding what to do with genetics, how to evaluate it, how to integrate it, and then how to translate it into food and exercise and supplements and stress management and all those things. And so it's a much harder journey than just doing a 23andMe test, right? Because you just pay them your money and you get your report, and you don't have to spend months training practitioners and webinars and education. And we built a mentorship program because practitioners who do not know genetics, even if they study it, when they do that first patient and they're sitting with a person, they want a whole lot of hand-holding to make sure that they're doing the job the way it needs to be done.
Right.
So that's kind of that's the journey, starting with my grad getting sick and landing up where, can we make a difference? Can we do things differently? Can we prevent cancer? Can we manage it better than the answers that we had 30 years ago?
Yeah. Is this Manuka Science? Am I pronouncing that right?
Manuka Science was the education company. So when I left genetics, and when I turned my back on genetic testing and said, I'm done, I've focused on education, and I built Manuka Science, which is we call it a translational nutrigenomics education company. How do I translate genetics for clinical practice?
Right.
And I have a wonderful co-author who wrote all that. And for many years, all I did, it's an online program. It's only for practitioners though. It's really, really hard. And all I did was education and teaching. But then I went back into building again, and I brought my education with me. So every practitioner who works with our test gets educated in how to use it.
And perhaps you could use yourself as an example, or perhaps a patient that you've had, about what they or you learned about themselves and how how they changed because of it.
Yes, I'll tell. That's again a very big question, but so the way we built this test is we didn't want people to have to choose. Should I do a diet genetic test? Should I do a sports genetic test? Should I do a mind genetic test? Because the reality is, with genetics, we don't know what we don't know. Yeah. We don't know things about ourselves. And also, sometimes you can do a diet genetic test and you get a Mediterranean diet, but actually the issue isn't about diet and it's sitting in detox inflammation or cognitive or addiction behavior, right? So I wanted to build something that gave insight into multiple facets of who we are. So it's divided up into 6 categories. So I'll just give you a sense of the 6 categories, and I think that will answer your question of is the kind of information you get. So because my background is in functional medicine and functional medicine training, I always want to know, what is the root cause of something? So I'm not so interested in a doctor telling me I've got diabetes, or I want to know why and where did it start? Because all these diseases start 10, 20, 30, 40 years before. Something started dysfunctioning in our body a long time ago that eventually manifested as symptoms or disease. So the first section we call the cellular section, which is how optimally are my cells functioning? And we talk about detoxification, because even though we talk about the liver as being a detoxifier, every single cell in our body detoxifies as well. So how efficient am I at detoxifying toxins? How susceptible am I to inflammation? Inflammation, of course, is so big, particularly with what we're seeing with COVID. Oxidative stress is also part of the COVID scenario. Inflammation, oxidative stress, methylation. These are what we call our core cellular processes. If they're not functioning optimally, it doesn't matter what else we look at. So we start at the top. Are they functioning optimally? Then we go to what we call the systems level. In systems, we look at things like glucose and insulin. Am I susceptible to having my glucose and insulin not functioning optimally? We look at things like cognitive function. Do I have some susceptibility to some dementia or memory loss later on in life? Because there's so much we can do, right? There's so much we can do. There's another one which is around mood. Am I susceptible to anxiety, depression, kind of mood dysregulation? Again, so much we can do with nutrition and with nutrigenomics. We look at things like, I'm trying to think on the top of my head, estrogen, very big one, right? Estrogen, so hormones in women, we actually have two reports, one for men and one for women. How do we metabolize hormones? When we make decisions whether our daughters are going to go on the contraceptive pill, or we're going to take HRT, or we're going to take contraceptive pill, we want to understand, how does our body metabolize hormones? Because hormones, when they're not being metabolized in the body, are a high risk factor for estrogen cancers, ovarian and breast cancer. And we do a male version as well. We look at things like histamine, which is something that a molecule you find in food that some people really can't process and metabolize, can make you incredibly ill even without you realizing where it's coming from. Then we have a whole energy we have a cardiovascular system. So that's blood pressure, blood clotting, vascular health, lipid metabolism. Then one of my favorite sections is energy metabolism. So some people call it diet. I call it energy. It's what drives us to eat food. So why are some of us more driven to binge or snack or kind of develop these kind of eating disorders? When we eat the calories, how do we store them? Why are some of us more efficient at storing calories than others? Some of us are more kind of inflammatory when we gain weight, which has its own problems with it. And then how do we burn up energy? And there's two different parts to that. Some of us burn up energy when we're sitting, like I am now, and some when we're exercising. And actually, it's different for different people. Some people can exercise till the cows come home and still not burn up energy. And then the last one is this concept of weight loss resistance, of susceptibility to, it's more difficult for me. Despite doing everything right, I lose weight very slowly, I gain weight very easily. Why is it harder for me? So in the energy section, we answer all of that. Then we have an activity section, which is the sports. We could call it sports, we call it activity, because it could be recreational athletes, or getting someone off the sofa, and it can also be elite athletes like yourselves on a podium. So we talk about exercise potential, which is really VO2 max. So what is my baseline? Where do I start? And where can I go to? So for some of us, we'll train, everyone will improve, but for some, your improvements can take you close to the podium, right? We talk about what you spoke about, Dotsie, about sprint, which is actually power and endurance. And they're not two separate genetic categories. They're actually the same, because no one is purely power or purely endurance.
Yeah.
So what is the relationship between the ability to generate large amounts of power and the ability to go long and for a very long time and have kind of conservative energy? And then we look at things like recovery from training, injury. Why are some people more susceptible? So lots in the activity. And then the last section is nutrients. We look at gluten, we look at iron, we look at folate, B2, B6, choline, sodium, caffeine, and we look at about 12 different nutrients and how our body metabolizes them. So you get an incredible amount of insight, remember self-knowledge about who you are, that gives you something on what is actually going on with you. And then we can build an optimum diet for you based on all that knowledge.
Wow. Well, it sounds like people are going to really get a lot of great information out of it. And Dotsie, you need to tell the Olympic Committee about this test. A lot better than the one you might have taken. Thank you so much, Dr. Joffe, for being with us today and sharing all your amazing information on this very timely but complicated subject.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me. It is complicated, but it's super exciting. It's sometimes we need to work a little bit harder to get to the good stuff.
Yeah, I think people have a lot of action steps to take from this episode. So thank you so much. Hey, folks. Okay, back by very popular demand is our plant-powered plate fridge magnet, which you are going to receive for free if you leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. So here are the details. Just write your quick review. Does not need to be long, does not need to be a whole story. Just be honest and speak from the heart. Then take a quick screenshot of the review you wrote and email it to us at podcast@switchforgood.org. That's podcast@switchforgood.org. And include your mailing address so we can send you a power plate. We are doing this because the more reviews we garner, the higher we go in search results, which means more folks will learn about our podcast. So the power is in your hands. Leave us a review and zoom, your power plate arrives at your doorstep.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switchforgood.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to switch for good. This is the future.